Welcome to the Leeds Rugby League Heritage podcast. My name's Phil Daly. I'm the head of media and PR at Leeds Rhinos. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Tony Collins for this episode. And on this episode, we were talking about a very special person in the history of rugby league, both in terms of the sport, but also culturally. A man who was crucial to the sport and the growth of the sport, and also what we now know as modern day coaching within rugby league. And that man is Roy Francis. Tony, you've written a book about Roy that's going to come out in June this year. Introduce us to the man that was Roy Francis.
Oh, it's difficult to know where to start because I knew him because I was born in Bredon Hull. So even though we're Hull KR fans, our family, Roy Francis was kind of like he was almost like a god in a sense, that what he'd done for Hull and the respect that he had, and he's kind of almost in the hushed tones. And then, of course, he came here to Headingley and did exactly the same thing. So I kind of, eventually, when I decided to do the biography, I thought, it's going to be a great story about rugby league. He's the first black coach in professional sports in Britain. He's led Hull to Wembley twice. Obviously, was the coach of the famous water splash final for Leeds. But more than that, he just had this reputation amongst. You talk to sets of fans, certainly those who were around at the time he was coaching, but also those who know a bit about the history of their clubs. And he's on such a high pedestal. And then as I started to research it, his story is even more fascinating. As you say, in many ways, he was the founder of modern coaching. He introduced scientific training techniques in terms of fitness. He was the first player in rugby league and probably even football in Britain to use video camera to record matches and training sessions. Very big on team psychology. He knew how to motivate players and get the best out of players, and he spent a lot of time working with his players. And the other thing he did, which is very unusual for the time, he was very keen to get wives and girlfriends involved because he thought that a happy player is a player who's going to do his best, who's going to play at the peak performance. So, and then obviously there's the question of he's I think uniquely in any part of British society, he's a black guy who's leading predominantly white players. I mean, at Hull, Clive Sullivan came in the early 60s and a couple of other black players. But he's in that unique position, really, that you don't get in British society at the time where, white guys are looking up to him as a father figure. And they've said that and have talked to people like Johnny Whiteley or Alan Smith here. And Roy was their mentor, their guide as they kind of grew up from their teenage years and became adults. So that's what got me started on it. And it's just a fantastic story about rugby league and the inclusivity that you've always found in rugby league. But also it's a fantastic story about a man's life and his struggle to overcome the odds and to be the best and to become an iconic figure in rugby.
And he was overcoming those odds from birth, in terms of the life he was born into, and then what he decides to do, the sport he wants to play, the sport he's not allowed to play, and then he moves north. Every turn he's challenging what people expect of him.
Oh, exactly. I mean, this is what I mean by the story, because he was an illegitimate baby. His birth mother was a white woman in South Wales. His father was a guy called Lionel Francis, who was a miner and a preacher, and then later went to America, abandoned the family, or went to America to become a politician. And then Roy, shortly after he was born, Roy was adopted by his father's wife. So, which you can imagine was an incredible thing to do. That here's the products of your husband's affair, and you adopt the child and bring him up as your own. And to Roy and his sons who have contributed to the book, she was Roy's mother and their grandmother, and he felt more towards her than anybody else. So he had that disadvantage. He was a mixed race baby growing up in the 20s and 30s when there was a lot of prejudice. And when there were, people felt that mixed race babies were somehow abnormal or subnormal. But he fought against all that, became a really talented sportsman. He was a sprinter, a diver, did a little bit of boxing, and he captained the school rugby team. And he was obviously such a phenomenal talent that he played 4 games for Bryn Mawr rugby union club. Bryn Mawr was the town that he was brought up in, just at the top of the Welsh valleys. And straight from school, he went to play for Bryn Mawr Rugby Union, and he only played 4 games before a talent scout for Wigan, Arthur Fairfax, who later signed Trevor Foster, picked him up and basically said, you should sign for Wigan. Offered him £400, went to his mum, said, we want his son to sign. And she said yes. And I think part of that was, £400 in the middle of the Depression. It's a lot of money. And also, you can imagine, because of prejudice, difficult for a black kid to get a job. If there were any jobs at that time, because South Wales was hit hardest by the Depression. But also, it was a well-known fact that black rugby players wouldn't get picked for the Welsh national rugby union team. And there was no barrier in rugby league to being picked for England or Wales at that point for black players. And when Roy went to Wigan in 1936, they also had another black player, George Bennett, who had been come north from Wales, who had captain Wigan and also played for the Welsh rugby league team. So Roy could see a financial benefit, obviously, but also he could make full use of his talents in rugby league in a way that wouldn't be possible in rugby union.
And why do you think that was, just in a wider society question, that black players were so accepted in these rugby league communities, and actually they were judged on their talent rather than the colour of the skin?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's because rugby league was born on a principle that you should, if you're good enough, you should be allowed to play. And and the whole thing about broken time and being paid to take time off work to play rugby, it was about leveling the playing field. So it was a sport that was open to all talented people, regardless of what your background was, what your means were, how rich you were, what school you'd been to, or anything like that. And I think that principle of, if you're good enough, you'll play, is something that's absolutely intrinsic to rugby league, and you see it today as well. And that's not to say the game's not got problems or anything like that, but even so, unlike other sports, it's that founding principle that means that we've been more welcoming in our sport for a long time for black players from overseas than most sports in Britain have. And I think Roy was a beneficiary of that, and also living proof, the fact that he was the first black player to play for Great Britain in 1947, and in fact, he was the first black player to play for a Great Britain national team in any sport. And then he became the first black guy to coach a professional sports team in the 1950s. So he's kind of like a living example of the opportunities that rugby league could give people. I
suppose that's that old adage: if you can see it, you can be it, and players could aspire to follow in his footsteps. I know his time in the army during the war was key as well, where he was involved in it as a PT instructor. Do you think that shaped him as a coach? Because back then there wouldn't have been coaches as we know it now. There would have been trainers, but not necessarily coaches.
Yeah, that's right. Coaching, in the sense that we know it today, didn't really exist in terms of picking the team, planning the tactics, nurturing the players. As you said, basically there was a trainer who'd get the players fit, run on with a sponge during a match if they've been injured, and all that type of stuff. But in terms of having sort of the modern day manager coach that obviously we're all familiar with in all sports today, wasn't really a thing. And I think one of the great benefits that Roy had during the war was that when he started to train as a PT instructor, the army had actually got a very sophisticated training regime in place. And you can see that because it's not just Roy that benefited. Trevor Foster was another person who later became a coach. But also in football as well. You see a lot of the great football managers of the 50s and 60s, Matt Busby, Joe Mercer, Stan Cullis, they also became army PT instructors, and they took similar methods. And one of the interesting things was that when I went to the National Archives to look at what the training involved, see what Roy had to do, they had very precise manuals about how training should be conducted, what things you should concentrate on, all sorts, even the scientific stuff like physiology, muscle groups and all this type of thing. So Roy would have had what we today would think of as a sports science education. And he got a really good reputation as a PT instructor. I mean, so much so that I found there was a letter in the Daily Mirror in in the 1960s where somebody had written about, in response to an article they'd written, an interview with Roy, somebody who'd actually been in one of his, who'd been trained by Roy in the army, actually wrote in and said, "Oh, I'm not surprised that Roy's become a successful coach because he was just fantastic as a trainer when I was in the army. He wasn't one of these people who shouted and bawled and just tried to rule by fear. He was someone who got to know you, motivated you by finding out what your motivations were, and he was someone who understood people and understood how to get the best out of them by building their self-confidence and self-respect." And that's something that all the players that I spoke to who were coached by Roy said. You knew with Roy that you'd get respect as a player, and he'd treat you as an individual and an equal, and he didn't look down on you, he didn't treat you as a child. You always felt that no matter what Roy said to you, good or bad, he understood who you were and what your motivations were.
Yeah, it's interesting. You used the word father figure when you talked about his players, but obviously a father figure back in those days would be slightly different to what we probably see as a father figure now. But those players, when you speak to those players, I mean, I've spoke to Alan Smith about his relationship with Roy. They really did love him. There was love there for him, and I think that mutual respect, which potentially back then a father-son relationship wouldn't necessarily have been that.
Yeah,
it was something very special, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's not. He wasn't all the sort of authoritarian father figure who ruled with a rod of iron. He was very much, I suppose in today's terms, he's like a mentor, a guide. And that's one of the things that came out with the players that Johnny Whiteley at Hull, and I think Alan said the same thing, is that Roy kind of taught you how to be an adult, like how to dress, how to behave, how to go to, when you go out to a restaurant or to dinners that had been organised by the club, how to use your knife and fork and things like that. So very, it's sort of fatherly in that sense, giving the benefit of his life experience to the players. And I think that's, and even today, I don't think that's necessarily the way a lot of coaches work. But for Roy, it was about, in a sense, developing the whole person, which I know it's a big thing again in different circles today. And I think that sense that unlocking the potential of each individual was really the key to his success. Because in a lot of ways, when he talks to the players, it's not like he was a very technical coach that would have set pieces and set plays. When we're on the third tackle, if within their 20 meter zone, then we're going to do X, Y, and Z. It was very much about equipping the players with self-confidence to trust their instincts, but also to develop their skills, so they could take advantage. He was very, in a sense, I think he would have fitted in very well today in the modern era, because it was, words that we hear today about empowerment, things like that. Although he didn't use them, that's really what he was about.
And the sad thing is that obviously he died young and was never able to really get acknowledged by the wider love within rugby league, particularly Hull and Leeds, where he became such a hero. But the wider public didn't really get to see the groundbreaking work that he'd done.
Yeah, I think that's true. He kind of had a legacy in that a lot of players who he coached became coaches themselves. Sid Hines took over from him in 75, and Sid was one of the products of the Roy Francis School. Johnny Whiteley at Hull became Great Britain coach, basically trying to use the same methods as Roy did. And a lot of other players at various levels of the game went into coaching from their experience. So he did have a legacy, but it was kind of, I think one of the problems that Roy had, which is kind of an odd thing, was that during the war, he played for Dewsbury when Eddie Waring was the manager of Dewsbury, and Eddie Waring made sure the best players played for Dewsbury, so they were the top team during the war, through fair means or foul. And he was very close with Eddie Waring for a long time, but then they fell out. And I think that meant that Roy was never really seen on the BBC, because obviously Eddie was the gatekeeper and he was the person who was going to interview. So if you'd fallen out with Eddie, you weren't going to be on TV. And I think Roy, who was very, very charismatic, very articulate, he would have made a lot more headway if he had been on being a regular co-commentator on Grandstand or a colour commentator or an analyst or something like that. So I think he missed out because of lack of media opportunities. And then also I think that to some extent, it's difficult. It's really, really difficult for a coach to have a really long career. I mean, Roy coached for over 25 years. But I spoke to Peter Rowe, former Bradford player, Keighley coach, really insightful guy about the game, and he said it's for a coach. Once you get past a certain stage, it becomes more difficult because unless you've got an unparalleled level of success, such as Wayne Bennett, you find it becomes difficult to relate to a younger generation. I think to some extent, Roy found that. Particularly after, because he went to Australia after the Water Splash final and coached North Sydney for a couple of years. He had a tough time there, thanks to the Australian media by and large. And I think that knocked his confidence. And he came back in the 70s, and the game had changed. And he kind of was a little bit at odds with where the game was at that point. And found himself a little bit of a man out of town, which is a tragedy. And as you say, towards the end of his life, he never really got the credit he deserved. Yet, on the other hand, the way the Kangaroos in 1982, 1986 played was really how Roy wanted his teams to play. Everybody could run and pass like a back. Everybody could tackle like a forward, and that's what the message of Roy Francis football really was. So, and the other thing that came out in the research for the book, talking to people in Australia and also to Jim Mills, who played with him at North Sydney, was that Jack Gibson, the father of Australian coaching, was a big pal of Roy's, and he used to, according to Jim, Jack Gibson used to ring Roy up every week before matches to pick his brains. So there's a bit of there's a little bit of Roy in the way the Australians play rugby league today. So in a sense, although it's not that widely recognised, he lives on in the way we see the game today.
That's fascinating, Tony. Thanks for joining us. And just we probably could have gone for a couple of hours talking about the incredible life of Roy Francis. We're certainly looking forward to reading Tony's book when it comes out in June. Just a light insight into a few things. I can't wait to find out what the fallout was with Eddie Waring, what happened at North Sydney, all those relationships. Great insight there, and someone who's very much remembered here at Leeds is Roy Francis. Thank you for joining us on the Leeds Rugby League Heritage podcast. Please make sure that you subscribe for all the latest episodes when they drop. Give us a like, give us a comment as well to make sure that we spare the word around about heritage here at Leeds Rugby League. And we'll have more episodes coming up. Thanks for joining us.